Hello. Oh, good morning. So I've come to talk to you about RESTful XQuery. And if I can just get this into the right place. OK, great. So what's this really all about? There's a few things that I'm going to sort of cover. One is the problem. And this isn't necessarily your problem, but it might also be your problem. But it's certainly a problem that I had. Then I'm going to look at a way that I think we can solve this. And then, having sort of come up with a way that we might solve this, I've implemented a proof of concept of the approach, and I'd quite like to demo that as well. So, the problem. So, how did we end up here listening to me talking about this? Or why do I care about it? So, I've been trying to build web apps in XML since about 2005. And some people think this is crazy, and some people think it's a really good idea. So why do I think that producing web apps using XML technologies is a good idea? Basically, it's all to do with the type model in XQuery or XSLT. It's very aligned with what I need for producing HTML or XHTML. And I don't have to deal with sort of database abstraction layers and converting data types around. I can really just use XPath over XML and produce XHTML or HTML. And that really works very well. I think ETH, Zurich have written some papers about this where you can go and read about some experiments that they did to see how much more efficient it was to write these things in XQuery as opposed to Java or PHP. So that's why I'm doing it. Is anybody else here building web apps just using XML technologies? Yes. OK, great. Is anybody doing it just using XQuery? Fantastic. OK. So the biggest problem that I have with doing this is there's no standard. OK. So if I'm working on Exist or MarkLogic or one of the other platforms, I have to take a very Exist or very MarkLogic approach to building a web app using XML technologies. So the biggest problem is there's no standard for web connectivity to sort of XML server-side processing. So I can't associate a URI with an XQuery script or an XSLT document. There's no standard way of doing this, right? I have to use a vendor implementation to do this. And in addition, there's no way to access the web context. So imagine that I could associate a URI with this script or XSLT or whatever. When the thing's running, I can't sort of examine the HTTP request and see, oh, did they send me some parameters on the URL or something like this? Again, I have to fall back to vendor extensions. So it's nice that there are vendor extensions, right? Because you can do it. But it leads to problems because I can't really write code that I can share easily with the whole community. I can share it with this part of the community that run Exist, or this part that run MarkLogic, or this part that runs Zorba or BaseX, or whichever platform. So whilst I tend to use all XML technologies, I really do believe it's the right tool for the right job. I'm going to focus in this presentation solely on XQuery. But I believe that the approach that I'm sort of proposing really applies to XSLT and certainly XProc as well, and potentially other things. So I've tried to sort of illustrate the problem that I have with an example. So we have a wheel factory, and this wheel factory really just does 4 things. Okay? So it can create wheels, and it can put wheels into its warehouse. And you can get an inventory of what's in the warehouse. And you can also go and retrieve one of the wheels that you've created from the warehouse. Okay? This is very, very simple. So I wrote it in XQuery. Why not? But I really wrote a module to do it, right? So there's 4 things this thing has to do, so there's 4 functions. So there's a create wheel, there's a store wheel, there's an inventory function, and there's a retrieve wheel function. Okay. Now, whilst some of the internals of these functions are a little bit ExistDB specific, they really apply to any XQuery processor where you have access to a database or document store. Okay. So we've got our wheel factory, and we're very happy with this, and we've been using it for a while. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, I really want to put your wheel factory on the web. And you sort of think, OK, yeah, we can do this. But we can't do it without vendor extensions. OK? So I need extension functions in XQuery so that I can pull out parts of the URL or find out if it was a GET or a POST request. I also need extensions to manipulate the response. So if I want to do a 404 document not found, how can I do this from XQuery? And in addition, obviously, whatever platform I'm running on, MarkLogic or Exist, I have to rely on the fact that they've implemented some sort of web server that talks to all of this. Okay. But we have a wheel factory, and we want to basically assign URIs to our services. So we very simply choose some HTTP methods, post, put, get, and get again, and come up with a very nice URI scheme for this, right? Because everybody likes nice addressable URIs that are easy to understand. And they should be logical, right? So all good URIs, right? So if I want a wheel, I can just put the ID of the wheel on the end, and it goes and retrieves my wheel. So I have a couple of examples of implementing this and why using the current sort of vendor approaches is difficult or sort of convoluted. So if we look at how we'd do this in Exist, what I have to do is I have to basically write what we call an Exist controller, URL controller, and this just dispatches to my code. So what you end up doing, in effect, is writing a lot of sort of if statements, trying to do path matching. And this controller has the full power of XQuery. I don't just have to redirect it to some other code. I could actually do the processing in the controller if I want. But this thing isn't particularly easy to read, right? I've had to write quite a lot of code. So this is just, let's see, to go and get one of the wheels from my warehouse. Well, I have to extract the ID, which came in as part of the URI. I have to check that it was a GET request, because otherwise I'm servicing the wrong thing. And then I actually call my module that we saw previously, wheel, retrieve, wheel. And then I have to some sort of like unmarshal the response from here and sort of decide, did I actually get a wheel or is it a 404? Otherwise, I need to send back the wheel to the browser or the RESTful client or whatever's happening. The problem, there's several problems with this approach, but one of them is that we're only working with 4 functions here, right? And yet I've got almost 2 pages of code just to wire in my URLs and sort of adapt this stuff. It's not very readable, and it really becomes problematic in a large system. And I've written some large systems using this approach, where this controller can easily end up at several thousand lines of XQuery. And it's really just a complete spaghetti of if-else statements. And it becomes very, very hard to maintain and sort of understand actually which URIs are mapping onto what functionality. Okay, so I also implemented this in MarkLogic to see sort of how they do this. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this in MarkLogic. But sort of the one that's quite well documented on the website and is quite modern is their REST library. So I've taken that approach. So the first thing you have to do in MarkLogic is a bit like Exist controller. You have to write a dispatcher that sort of intercepts your URLs and sends them off to a script. But with their REST library, they provide a function library to sort of handle most of the pain of this for you. So you really just call their REST library. And you have to tell it what it is that you actually want the endpoints of your services to be. And you describe those in a separate file. So this is what the endpoints itself looks like. So arguably, this is a little bit better, because I don't have to write so much XQuery. It's more declarative. I can just write some XML that sort of says, for this URI here, where I want to match this and this pattern, so this is the ID of my wheel. I can go and extract that ID, right? And I can call an XQuery script. So we've got 4 endpoints in here. There's another page of this, 1 for each of our functions. The problem with this is that I can't directly call a function in a module, because my URL rewriter in MarkLogic has to return a URL, which then MarkLogic interprets as the script to call next. So I actually have to write a sort of proxy script that does the processing. So this script just tells MarkLogic to go and call my proxy script, and then my proxy script talks to my wheel module, okay, my XQuery module that does all my wheels. So this is kind of the rest of this, right, the other 2 services. Okay, and then I have my wheel proxy. So this is basically just a little wrapper, and it talks to retrieve wheel, store wheel, inventory, and create wheel. But again, because I can't really get everything that I want with the REST library and the URL rewriting stuff, and I may be doing something wrong perhaps even, but I still have to do things in here like extract the request body, and I still have to deal with sort of mapping parameters into and out of my functions. Okay, they've been pulled out for the URLs and stuff for me, so it's a bit easier, but it's still not perhaps ideal. Okay, so the feeling that I have is that when I write XQuery Web Apps, I'm really sort of chuffed with myself when I finished one. They tend to be very, very small and succinct, and I haven't really had to expend a lot of effort to do it. So I always feel that they're quite beautiful things. But what upsets me is that each one is a slightly different shape. So my exist web app doesn't run on MarkLogic, and my MarkLogic web app doesn't run on exist, and vice versa. So I have this idea that I'm sort of riding a bike with square wheels, really, and I'm on a sawtooth-shaped road. So the problem, as I said, there's no standard. There's a good reason why there's no standard, which is I think it's probably out of scope for the XQuery working group. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think the XQuery working group does really good stuff focusing on the core language. And there's lots of arguments. You could argue this either way, probably, if you really wanted to. But originally, these languages were never really intended to be sort of ran in the web in this way. But it works really well. So I sort of want to see this happen a bit more. So I have a sort of proposal for this, how this could happen. And you need to sort of read the paper that I've written for the conference, really, because it's all a lot more detail in there that I can possibly give you in the next 25 minutes. So how did I try and solve this problem? Well, first of all, I sort of thought about what it was that I really wanted to achieve, apart from having sort of web apps in XQuery that I can run anywhere. So portable, okay, so I do want the code to run anywhere. I don't want vendor extensions. I don't want to rely on sort of one platform having one feature and another platform having a different feature. But at the same time, I didn't want to create something that was so much up in an ivory tower that nobody could ever implement this thing. So I've tried to keep it quite simple so that hopefully implementations like MarkLogic exists, 28 millisecs, all of the others can kind of pick this up and sort of run with it. I've also tried to make it quite simple for XQuery developers because I really want it so that you can just add this to your existing code. And I've tried to sort of improve on what's available. Okay? So XQuery 3.0 has annotations. At the moment, there's just % public and % private built in to define function scope. But they state in the spec, implementations can define your own. So rather than an implementation do it, I've tried to write a standard to define a set of annotations. And I've borrowed very, very heavily from JAX RS, which is Java annotations for REST, right? So what do these things look like? So you take your existing function, and you can apply URI to it. Okay? I have two sorts of annotations, right? I have constraint annotations, which are sort of filter down the request and what applies to your function. And I have parameter annotations, so you want to extract things from URIs, or you want to extract things from the query string. And what I've kind of done here is said that functions that have these annotations are called resource functions. Okay? So a path annotation looks a little bit like this. Okay? We have URI templating built in. So if my function is down here, and I put this annotation on it, this is how this part of the URI gets mapped into a variable in my function. And there's a certain amount of auto type conversion that I've tried to build into the spec there. So if this thing's a number, and you've declared it as an integer here, at runtime it'll attempt to auto-convert it for you. And you can have multiple templates in a URI, okay, so you can pull this in. But because I also wanted you to be able to apply this to existing code, I've said that if you have additional parameters in your function, as long as the cardinality of them is 0 or 1 or 0 or more, you can leave those parameters in your function, and I'll just ignore them. Okay. So we have a whole bunch more of these annotations. So you can specify the HTTP method that you want to execute. And you can add one or more of these to your function, right? You can also map in the request body. So you can pass in the entire request body into a function parameter. We've got media type annotations, so you can actually use these for content negotiation if you wanted to. So this one is based on the HTTP content type header that comes in, and this one's based on the HTTP accept header that comes in. So again, these filter down what your function applies to. And in terms of how do I get the result of my function back to my RESTful client or the web browser, serialization, I've kind of said either the result that goes back is the result of your function, or you can also provide some information and the result of the function. Okay? And I've kind of allowed you to set HTTP headers by creating this REST response element that you can pass out of your function. And you can also set the status code and the description and these kind of things. And in addition to that, I sort of thought, well, what if my function produces XML, like XQuery typically does, but I really want HTML5 or XHTML? So I've adopted the XQuery and XSLT serialization spec, but applied it to annotations. So if you have this declared in an XQuery module, I can override it on a per function basis by putting these annotations on my function. Okay, so I have a proof of concept demo, but I think from what I'm seeing that I'm sort of really running out of time to show this. Do I have time to show a quick demo? Okay, maybe. So. We can make the weekend longer if we have to. Oh, really? Okay. So you're enjoying it. Good. So here's an example, right? So here's a function with an annotation on it, and it says sort of REST get. So it's going to apply to a get request, and there's a path. And this name, whatever comes after the URI, is going to be injected into my function. Okay. So I can invoke this query from my browser. Okay. And obviously, I mean, we can change this, right? So we can put anything we want in the URI. So you can say hello. So this is quite powerful because I haven't had to write any sort of code to map all of this stuff around or serialize it or deserialize it. And the other thing is that the annotations are declarative, right? And they're on the code sides. So it should be very easy if I look at an XQuery to understand which URIs are mapping onto which functions. And we have a whole bunch of examples. So this one, okay, goodbye fear, which is how I was feeling this morning. But it sets a 404, okay? So that one's there. And this is the REST response rate, and this is how I set my 404. And then I have my content that comes out of my function. Okay. So you can sort of read up about these annotations in the paper that I submitted to the conference. Okay. Okay, does anybody have any questions?
Up to one short question, please.
I like it. Really cool stuff. How do you propose to handle, you know, in like Tomcat when you want to do a redirect or a forward of a request from one function to another?
Okay, so in terms of forward, I would use the REST response to set the status code to 302. And there's an element that you can have in there to set a URI. So I would pass that back as the header. So the location, right? HTTP header location, the new URI, and then the status 302. So that should handle that for you perfectly.
Hi, Liam Quinn, W3C XML activity lead. So whether doing RESTful web app backends is in the scope of the XQuery and XProc and XSLT working groups or not, I think is a good question perhaps, but isn't the right question. The right question is, do we want it to be in the scope? And if so, let's put it there. And if we don't, do we want to start a new working group or a community group or some combination for whom it is in the scope? And if so, let's do it.
Okay, great.
And because I agree with you.
Thank you. So my next step was going to be to write this up as a sort of semi-specification and then look for somewhere to publish it, whether it's an XQuery community group or it's the XQuery project or wherever, I'm not sure yet. But I really want to put it out there for everybody to use and play with and contribute to, I hope. So.
Yeah, XSLT, the EXSLT people are working on an HTTP client, and there's different approaches that people are proposing there too. I think this is a hot area. I like your approach here a lot. I really like your approach here. The way you get a standard is you get all the people who care together in a room and have some way of persuading them that we need to have one way of doing it, and you can't, no one person is going to get their way. And yeah, I think we need to do this in some way. Getting the W3C to take it up would be a great way to do it because they've got good process for that sort of thing. I think that how you tie XQuery to other things, including web architecture, including relational databases, all that sort of stuff, is stuff that does need to be standardized, and it makes a big difference in how useful the language is.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have more questions, please remember them, and you can catch Adam and ask him during lunchtime. And we need to switch to the next presentation.